They say a locked door is safety. But what if it's a prison? Imagine this. A marble staircase gleaming in the gray light of dawn, the silence of a mansion worth more than a city block, and at its base, a an emerald gown still warm, as if its owner had just slipped out of it moments ago. But the woman who wore it is gone. No trace, no sound, no scream, nothing. Her husband, Cornelius Vandermark, one of Pittsburgh's most powerful steel barons, found that dress waiting for him on December 12, 1887. He would never see his wife again. And from that moment on, the city itself seemed to turn inside out, revealing shadows that had been there all along, hidden just beneath the surface of respectability. Do you see it already? This wasn't just the story of a missing woman. It was the story of a system built on silence, corruption, and sacrifice. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The police called it an unsolvable case. But the men who really ran Pittsburgh knew the truth. Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable price of crossing a man whose empire had been forged in blood. Here's the part they never told you because they couldn't. When Evangeline vanished, the front door was locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. 12 servants, stationed across the house, swore they saw nothing. And yet, her dress was still warm when Cornelius touched it. You can feel it, can't you? That creeping awareness that you are being shown something you were never meant to see. Evangeline had been asking questions about her husband's fortune, about the accidents in his mills, about the competitors who kept dying in fires, explosions, and sudden disappearances. She wasn't the naive young bride the society pages wrote about. She was building a case, piece by piece. And in 1887, that was as dangerous as playing with dynamite. The official investigation lasted just 6 days before being shut down. The city's leaders, bound to Vandermark through bribes, debts, and favors, made sure the silence held. But behind that silence, a secret war was unfolding, a war that claimed Evangeline as its first public sacrifice. What happened in that mansion wasn't just a disappearance. It was a message, a warning, a ritual of control carried out in plain sight. And tonight, I'm going to take you inside it. Steel. That was Pittsburgh's altar, and men like Cornelius Vandermark were its priests. In 1887, the city was a machine that devoured human beings and spat out fortunes for the few who knew how to harness its fire. Day and night, furnaces belched smoke so thick it stained the snow black. The air itself tasted like iron. Men worked 12-hour shifts until their lungs bled and their bones buckled. Also, the rich could build towers, railroads, and empires. And at the very top of that hierarchy stood Vandermarken, industrial king, whose word carried more weight than the law. But here's the hidden truth they don't teach you in school. Every empire is maintained by shadows. The wealth you see on the surface, the mansions, the chandeliers, the banquets, rests on a foundation of silence, blood, and secrets. Cornelius understood this. He learned early that the system rewards not just innovation, but domination. A competitor's factory doesn't just close, it burns. A rival engineer doesn't just resign, vanishes. And the police, the judges, the politicians, all for sale like cattle at the market. That is how Pittsburgh was truly governed. Not by democracy, but by money wrapped around the throat of justice. Evangeline, his wife, walked straight into this machinery of control without realizing it. At first, she was his ornament, young, beautiful, educated, a symbol of refinement to disguise the brutality of his empire. But she had something her husband didn't expect: conscience. She asked why the mills killed so many men. She noticed how the deaths always seemed to benefit Cornelius. She started to keep records, conversations, dates, whispers from the servants, fragments of newspaper reports. She was building a map of the corruption, a map that, if revealed, could tear down everything he had created. And so the mansion itself became a stage. Every night, banquets filled with laughter, champagne, and gilded masks of civility. Every morning, Evangeline sat at her desk, recording what she saw, piecing together the puzzle, moving closer to a revelation that could not be allowed. She believed she was uncovering the truth. What she didn't know was that the truth had already marked her. The gown on the marble floor was not just clothing. It was a symbol, a ritual stripping away of identity, a message carved into silence. The disappearance wasn't random, it was surgical. Precision work. Executed inside a house locked from within, with 12 witnesses who somehow saw nothing. That is not coincidence. That is power. That is control. And when you understand that, you begin to see that Evangeline's story was never just hers. It was the story of every man and woman crushed beneath an invisible empire that pretends to protect you, even as it devours you whole. Picture her alone in the library, the firelight flickering against shelves of leather-bound books, her emerald eyes scanning lines of history that most men of her time would never bother to read. This was Evangeline Vandermark's sanctuary, the one place in the mansion where Cornelius's shadow seemed to falter. She filled her journals with careful notes. Names of dead workers, details of the accidents, patterns of dates that revealed a rhythm to the destruction. She wasn't just keeping a diary. She was compiling evidence. And in a city where silence was enforced with fire and rope, that evidence was more dangerous than a loaded revolver. Servants noticed the change first. The long walks through smoke-choked neighborhoods, the quiet conversations with widows, the way she returned with her silk hem stained by mud and ash. Evangeline was building something bigger than herself. A network of whispers, a web of truths drawn from the mouths of men who had lost everything in Vandermark's steel empire. She learned of rival factories that mysteriously collapsed just before Vandermark acquired the land. Of union organizers whose deaths were disguised as accidents. Of inspectors who lived richly after ignoring safety violations that killed dozens. Every piece fit together like a puzzle she was destined to solve. But here is where the story cuts deeper. Evangeline was not just an idealist. She was a Hartwell, the daughter of one of Boston's most powerful banking families. That bloodline had its own secrets, its own debts, its own shadowed history. She understood power in a way most women of her time could not. She knew what it meant to hold influence, and she knew how men like her husband wielded it. This wasn't naivety. It was rebellion. She believed that by exposing Cornelius, she could reshape the destiny of an empire. She underestimated the game, because every step she took, Cornelius already knew. The servants who seemed loyal, some were his eyes. The letters she posted, intercepted. The journal she locked with a small brass key around her neck, a key he had already duplicated. Evangeline thought she was uncovering his crimes. In truth, she was walking deeper into a maze he had designed, one where the walls shifted and the exits vanished. The night she disappeared was not the night she lost. It was the night her story was weaponized. Her gown on the marble floor was not the end, it was the beginning of something larger. A message to anyone who dares peel back the mask of the powerful. A warning written in silence, for those who think truth is stronger than empire. Pittsburgh in 1887 was not a city, it was an engine. Coal-fed, steel-forged, and blood-lubricated. To the men who controlled it, human life was just another raw material. The average worker made barely enough to feed his family, while Cornelius Vandermark and his peers built Gothic mansions with crystal chandeliers and marble staircases imported from Europe. But beneath all that luxury lay something darker. A pact. The barons of Pittsburgh had formed a quiet alliance, an invisible syndicate that determined who rose, who fell, and who vanished. Evangeline had stumbled into that syndicate's most dangerous secret. Her investigation into Cornelius wasn't just about him, it pointed toward an entire network. She uncovered ledgers where bribes to judges and aldermen were disguised as charitable donations. She discovered that fires which gutted rival factories were always followed by land purchases traced back to the same four families. She noticed that when men tried to form unions, accidents spiked, often killing leaders in staged boiler explosions. Each piece led back to a central truth. Pittsburgh was not ruled by the city council or the governor. It was ruled by a hidden order of industrialists who used fear and silence as their tools. And here's where it cuts even deeper. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. To keep the immigrant masses obedient, to keep the city from revolting, the elite orchestrated spectacles of tragedy. When a mill burned, when a tenement collapsed, it wasn't just business, it was psychological warfare. The poor learned to accept suffering as inevitable. The newspapers, owned by the barons, reinforced the message. Accidents happen, progress has a price. Better to remain silent than to challenge destiny. That was the script. That was the programming. Evangeline, by following the trail, threatened to unmask not only her husband but the entire machinery of manipulation. She believed truth was a weapon. But to men like Cornelius, truth was only dangerous if it escaped. And they had perfected the art of silencing escape. Her disappearance was not just a crime of passion or jealousy. It was a ritual sacrifice to the order itself. A reminder that no matter how high your status, no matter your family name or education, if you defy the syndicate, you vanish. And your absence becomes louder than your voice ever was. This is the lesson no historian will admit. The Gilded Age was not just an age of wealth, it was an age of controlled disappearance. And Evangeline Vandermark became one of its most chilling examples. Look into the eyes of Cornelius Vandermark, and you begin to understand what true power looks like when stripped of illusion. His portraits from that era still serve a vestigial gray hair swept back, jaw locked in stone, eyes that seem to pierce through flesh to the bone. But a portrait cannot show you the truth. The truth is that Cornelius was not just a businessman. He was an architect of obedience. He had studied the way men break in the mills, the way hunger shapes loyalty, the way fear binds silence. He carried those lessons from the furnace floor into the boardroom and finally into his own home. To him, Evangeline was not simply a wife. She was an asset, a tool of legitimacy. Her bloodline brought Boston banking power to his empire, opening vaults of capital he could never have accessed alone. But when she shifted from asset to liability, he did not hesitate. Because Cornelius had long ago trained himself to cut away anything that threatened his rise. A rival, a factory, a wife. To him, the categories were identical. Life and death were simply moves on a chessboard where he alone set the rules. But here is the part that unsettles men who hear it. Cornelius was not unique. He was not a monster born in isolation. He was a product of his time, shaped by a society that rewarded brutality disguised as vision. Men like him believed they were gods of industry, entitled to reshape the world as they pleased. And when gods rule, sacrifices are inevitable. Evangeline's disappearance was not an accident, it was theology. A ritual act of domination, carried out not in some remote temple, but in a Fifth Avenue mansion with stained glass and gargoyles imported from Europe. Think about the psychology of it. The locked doors, the silent servants, the gown left warm upon the floor. It was a staged performance, a message to those who lived within the orbit of his empire. Defiance does not vanish quietly, it vanishes completely. Cornelius understood that fear is most potent when it comes without explanation. No blood.
No scream.
Just absence. A void that devours memory and leaves only submission behind. And this is where we must confront a darker truth. You have been trained, just like the people of Pittsburgh, to believe absence is natural. People vanish from history books. Questions vanish from public debate. Entire stories vanish from collective memory. And when they do, the empire grows stronger. Evangeline's disappearance was not just her fate, it was a rehearsal for hours. The Vandermark mansion did not sleep the night Evangeline vanished. 12 servants, each hand-picked for loyalty, each sworn to discretion, walked its echoing halls. Yet when morning came, not one claimed to have heard a sound. Not one admitted to seeing her leave. And still, her gown lay folded on the marble, radiating the warmth of a body no longer there. Do you understand what that means? These were not mere witnesses. They were participants in silence. Whether willingly or through fear, they became the scaffolding that held Cornelius's performance in place. Consider Margaret Sullivan, the head housekeeper, a woman of iron discipline who had survived famine in Ireland only to bend her will to the demands of American wealth. She was the one who insisted every clock in the house remain perfectly wound, every curtain drawn at precise hours. Yet she testified later that on that night, nothing disturbed her sleep. Nothing. a claim as unbelievable as it was necessary. For Margaret knew what many immigrants of her generation learned quickly. Survival depends on silence. To speak against the master was to risk everything. Or Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper. His eyes missed nothing new, every footprint, every bend in the hedges, every shift in the soil. That morning, he found strange impressions near the ice house, shapes too deliberate to be the work of frost. And yet, he reported nothing to the police. Why? Because the estate itself was a cage. Cornelius's men watched not only the city but their own. A misplaced word could lead to dismissal or worse, disappearance. Thomas swallowed his truth, burying it as carefully as he tended the gardens. And then there was Charles Henley, the butler, present at every dinner, privy to every whispered argument. He alone had witnessed the rising tension between Cornelius and Evangeline. He alone may have heard the arguments behind closed doors. But when questioned, he swore he saw her retire to her chambers that night in the very same gown found later in the foyer. A contradiction so sharp it should have torn the story apart. Yet the police accepted it, because silence, once purchased, is louder than any confession. This is the hidden machinery. Not just the powerful man, but the web of ordinary souls who enable him. Some by fear, some by greed, some by resignation. Evangeline vanished not because 12 people were blind, but because 12 people chose blindness over truth. And that is how empires endure, not by force alone, but by the quiet complicity of those who whisper to themselves, "Better her than me." Step beyond the iron gates of the Vandermark estate, and you enter a different kind of theater, the city itself. In December of 1887, Pittsburgh was humming with rumors of Evangeline's disappearance. But if you turned to the newspapers, you would find only carefully crafted whispers. A brief mention of a society wife missing. A suggestion that perhaps she had taken ill. A quiet correction days later, reporting that the case had been closed due to lack of evidence. Nothing more.
No scandal. No outrage.
Just silence, printed in black ink and sold as truth. You must understand Pittsburgh's press was not free. It was owned. Editors sat in drawing rooms with men like Cornelius, drinking brandy, their loyalty secured through advertising money and business ties. What story could they tell? That the city's most powerful man had allowed his wife to vanish under impossible circumstances? That a locked house concealed something darker than mere tragedy? To print such words would be to sign one's own death warrant, financially if not physically. And so the presses obeyed. They erased her. They turned flesh and blood into rumor, and rumor into nothing. The politicians followed suit. 6 days into the investigation, the police declared the matter closed. Not because they lacked leads, but because they lacked permission. Evidence was never sought, testimonies never pressed. The official record shows nothing beyond the surface. To the state, Evangeline had ceased to exist. And in that erasure lies the real power of institutions. It is not merely the ability to destroy a life, it is the ability to destroy its memory. Here is the truth they fear you knowing. History itself is curated silence. What you read in school, what you see carved into monuments, what you are told about progress and prosperity, all of it has been filtered through the hands of men who knew how to bury the inconvenient. Evangeline was not the first to vanish this way. She was simply the most visible. And that made her disappearance an act of spectacular and invisible performance meant to remind the city that wealth writes reality, and truth exists only if permitted. This is why the gown was left on the floor, still warm. It wasn't evidence. It was theater, a prop in a ritual staged for an audience of one city. A reminder that what is seen can be denied, and what is denied soon ceases to exist. And so the papers closed their columns, the officials closed their files, and the people of Pittsburgh learned to close their mouths. In the chaos of her disappearance, there was one detail the police overlooked, or rather, one detail they were told to overlook. Evangeline's journal. A leather-bound book, locked with a small brass clasp, the key worn around her neck like a charm. To outsiders, it was the pastime of a bored society wife. To Cornelius, it was a ticking time bomb. Inside those pages lay the truth no one dared whisper aloud. Names, dates, patterns of fire and blood, evidence that tied not just her husband but half the city's elite to a system of organized murder. Servants remembered seeing her at the desk, candlelight dripping over the margins as she wrote long into the night. Margaret, the housekeeper, recalled the way Evangeline's hand would tremble as she closed the journal, slipping it back into its locked drawer as if hiding a blade. Thomas, the groundskeeper, once caught sight of a page when she had stepped out briefly, the words "Ice House" underlined 3 times, next to a list of dates that matched fatal accidents across the mills. What did she know? What had she found buried in that frozen cellar beneath the gardens? The journal vanished the same night she did. When Cornelius claimed ignorance, his eyes betrayed nothing. Yet those close to him knew he feared that book more than any rival, more than any threat of scandal. Because paper endures where flesh does not. Evangeline's voice, trapped in ink, could still accuse him long after her body was gone. If the journal surfaced, it would not only destroy Cornelius, it would expose the syndicate itself, unraveling the illusion that Pittsburgh's prosperity was born of progress, rather than manipulation and sacrifice. And here is where the story sharpens. Fragments of that journal did survive. For decades, whispers circulated of a maid who smuggled out torn pages before the mansion was sealed. Rumors of a small chest hidden in a church crypt, containing the words of a woman who refused to stay silent, even in death. These fragments hinted at something greater than industrial sabotage. They suggested a pattern so vast it reached beyond Pittsburgh, Boston, New York, Chicago, an unbroken chain of disasters and deaths, all benefiting the same constellation of families. The journal became more than evidence. It became legend, a forbidden scripture of the Gilded Age. Some say its pages inspired whispers of rebellion in the tenements, that its words lived on as oral history, fueling suspicion against the barons. Others claim Cornelius spent his last years hunting for it, terrified that one day the truth would return, ink and paper outliving his empire of stone. That is why Evangeline's disappearance still haunts. Not because her body was never found, but because her words may still be out there, waiting for the right hands to unlock them. The ice house. On the surface, it was nothing more than a luxury of the wealth stone outbuilding tucked behind the Vandermark Gardens, used to store blocks of winter ice beneath layers of sawdust so the family could enjoy chilled wine and preserved meats long into the summer. But Evangeline had circled it in her journal, underlined the words 3 times. Why? Because the ice house was more than storage. It was a vault, a place where cold did not merely preserve food, it preserved silence. Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper, once admitted in a drunken whisper that he saw men unloading crates there at night, long after Cornelius had retired. Heavy crates carried with too much caution for simple provisions. He swore the air around the ice house always seemed colder than it should be, as if the chill bled out through the stone walls. And once, after a late snow, he found a trail of footprints leading to its door but never leading away. He mentioned this to Margaret Sullivan, the housekeeper. She told him never to repeat it. He never did, until years later when fear loosened his tongue. What Evangeline discovered was that the ice house was not just a place for food, it was a morgue. Private one. Rival engineers, union leaders, whistleblowers, those who threatened Cornelius's empire were stored there. Bodies hidden in plain sight, frozen until they could be discreetly removed or made to vanish into the rivers and furnaces of the city. It was a perfect cover. Who would question an ice house that never melted? Who would suspect that beneath the frozen blocks were the remains of men who once stood in Vandermark's way? The servants knew, at least in fragments. Strange odors, faint stains in the sawdust, locks changed more often than necessary. But none dared speak, because in the world Cornelius ruled, even a whisper was dangerous. Evangeline, however, broke the rule. She had traced the pattern of deaths, matched the dates to deliveries at the ice house, and realized what her husband had built. Not just an empire of steel, but a private cemetery disguised as a convenience of wealth. And here is where the darkness cuts deeper. Evangeline herself may have been placed there. Imagine her emerald gown laid out on the marble to confuse, while her body was lowered into the cold stone chamber just beyond the gardens, entombed among the very victims she had fought to avenge. That was Cornelius's final cruelty. turning her defiance into silence by placing her in the same vault of frozen shadows. If true, the ice house was not merely a hiding place. It was a symbol, proof that the empire thrived not on innovation, but on preservation of fear. A monument to the truth no one dared confront, that the cost of Pittsburgh's greatness was not progress, but bodies hidden in the cold. Fear. That was the true currency of the Gilded Age. Money built mansions, yes. Steel built cities, yes. But fear kept them standing. Cornelius Vandermark understood this better than any man alive. You can see it in every detail of Evangeline's disappearance, the locked doors, the silent servants, the gown laid out like a ghost on the marble floor. It wasn't only about removing her. It was about sculpting an absence so impossible, so haunting, that everyone who heard the story would remember the warning. If the wife of the wealthiest man in Pittsburgh could vanish inside her own house, then anyone could. Fear, you see, is more efficient than violence. A bullet ends a life. Fear ends resistance. Cornelius and the syndicate wielded it like a scalpel, cutting obedience into the bone of the city. Workers didn't organize strikes because they knew men who tried had fallen into boilers. Journalists didn't print the truth because they knew editors who had suddenly disappeared. Politicians didn't challenge the barons because they knew colleagues whose carriages had tumbled from bridges. Patterns of accident, patterns of silence, all stitched together into a language everyone understood, but no one dared speak. Evangeline's courage was dangerous because it broke the script. She believed truth could stand against fear. But the syndicate knew that even truth could be bent, buried, or turned into theater. Her gown wasn't left behind by chance, it was a symbol of control. A reminder that even the most intimate details of a woman's life could be transformed into a performance of power. And the longer people whispered about her, the deeper the fear burrowed into the city's soul. This is how control works, not with chains, but with psychology. You teach people to police themselves, to silence their own questions before they ever reach their lips. You make them complicit in their own submission. By the time they realize it, it is already too late. The system doesn't just demand obedience, it creates it. And this is where I ask you, directly, to step into the shadow Evangeline stood in. If you understand what I'm saying, if you feel that pull between fear and truth, I want you to write in the comments right now the phrase, "The ice never melts." The ice never melts. Write it twice and lock it into your memory, because those words are not just a comment. They are a key, a signal to yourself that you will not be silenced like the rest, that you will see what others refuse to see. This is the descent Evangeline began. And now it is yours too. Evangeline's disappearance was never just a domestic mystery. It was a message, a signal that stretched far beyond the Vandermark mansion, out past the smoke-stained mills of Pittsburgh, into the boardrooms of Boston, the marble halls of New York, the stockyards of Chicago. Because Cornelius was not an island. He was a node, a thread woven into a vast syndicate of barons and magnates who understood that control of industry was also control of destiny. Each city had its accidents, its unsolved disappearances, its fires that started in just the right place at just the right time. Rail cars derailed in Buffalo. Grain silos exploded in Kansas. Entire tenement blocks went up in flames in New York, all cleared land, silenced opposition, and consolidated power in the hands of the chosen few. Men like Carnegie, Gould, Pullman, Morgan. Names that history remembers as titans, but whose shadows were darker than the monuments suggest. Evangeline had stumbled onto this pattern. Her journal did not stop at Pittsburgh. In its final entries, those that servants whispered about but never saw, she traced the chain outward. She had marked names, dates, and incidents that should never have connected but did. It was no longer just about Cornelius. It was about a cartel of blood, hidden beneath the language of progress. She had uncovered that the railroads, the mills, the banks were not competing, they were conspiring. And here is where the truth sharpens into terror. Evangeline wasn't silenced simply for what she knew about her husband. She was silenced because she had begun to connect the dots across the nation. She had pierced the illusion of rivalry among the great families and exposed the quiet agreement that bound them all. Accidents were never accidents, disasters were never random, and progress was never clean. Cornelius was ordered to act, not merely to protect himself, but to protect them all. To let Evangeline live was to risk the unraveling of the very system that built America's wealth. She became not just a wife gone missing, but a sacrifice to preserve an empire of shadows. And yet her silence was imperfect. Rumors of the journal spread, fragments were smuggled, whispers passed from tenement to tavern. The syndicate had created their own curse. The more they tried to erase Evangeline, the more she became immortal, a phantom haunting the foundations of their empire. This is why her story matters even now. Because to look at Evangeline is to look at the moment when the private sins of the elite bled into the history of the nation. When one woman's courage brushed against the machinery of an empire built on fear. And though they froze her body, though they buried her words, they could never extinguish the spark she left behind. Pittsburgh changed after Evangeline's disappearance. The city did not speak her name in daylight, but at night, in taverns and kitchens, her presence grew larger than life. Some swore they saw her figure gliding past the iron gates of the Vandermark estate, her emerald gown shimmering like frost in the moonlight. Others whispered that her reflection appeared in the black waters of the Monongahela, staring back with eyes hollowed by betrayal. The servants of the house claimed the icehouse door would sometimes creak open on its own, even when locked from the outside, releasing a breath of unnatural cold that made their skin crawl. Margaret Sullivan, the housekeeper, once told her niece that she awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, soft, deliberate steps, and when she lit her candle, she saw drops of melted water trailing down the hall. Not blood, water, as if something frozen had been walking where no one should. The workers in the mills believed Evangeline's spirit favored them. When boilers burst or scaffolding collapsed, men said they heard a woman's voice in the roar of the flames, warning them, urging them to flee. Some lived by those warnings. Others died when they ignored them. To the laborers, she became less of a victim and more of a saint of vengeance, a martyr whose death gave her power to haunt the men who had destroyed her. But to the barons, to Cornelius's peers, she was something else entirely. A curse. Business deals soured, fortunes collapsed, heirs fell to sickness. Every calamity was whispered back to her, as if Evangeline was reaching out from the grave to dismantle the empire they had tried to bury her beneath. Cornelius himself grew paranoid, walking the halls of his mansion with lamps blazing, as if afraid of the dark. He ordered the ice house sealed in iron and yet claimed to hear knocking from within. Some said he drank himself to sleep each night because he could no longer endure the sound of melting water dripping through the walls. Evangeline's story had become a haunting not just of place, but of conscience. The city itself seemed to bend under her memory, as if the smoke in the sky and the soot on the cobblestones carried her name in silence. Whether ghost or legend, she was inescapable. She had become what Cornelius feared most. Not silence, but a voice that could not be contained. And so the legend grew. From the parlor to the factory floor, from the riverbanks to the graveyards, the people whispered it over and over. The ice never melts. The ice never melts. Decades passed before the ice house was touched again. The Vandermark fortune had crumbled. Cornelius long since rotted in his marble tomb. His heirs scattered, mad, or bankrupt. By the 1920s, the estate was little more than a decaying relic. The iron gates sagged. The mansion's once glorious chandeliers lay shattered in dusty halls. But the ice house remained sealed, its iron-bound door sunk deep into the earth like a wound that had never healed. It was prohibition that brought men back to it. Bootleggers searching for a hiding place pried the locks loose one moonless night. They expected an empty chamber, a forgotten storehouse for ice and salt. Instead, they found air that did not belong to the living, air so cold and sharp it cut their lungs. Air that had not stirred since Evangeline's time. And in that silence, they saw her. At first, they thought it was a statue. A woman preserved in perfect stillness, skin pale as alabaster, lips tinged blue. Her emerald gown still clung to her frame, threads stiffened by frost. Her eyes, half open, seemed to watch them with a glassy accusation. The bootleggers dropped their lantern in terror, but the flame sputtered and did not die. It was then they realized. She had not decayed. Not a day, not a year. Evangeline Vandermark was still there, sealed in ice that should have melted long ago. One man swore that when the heat of their breath filled the chamber, the frost upon her lashes began to weep. Tiny rivulets of water slid down her cheek like tears, and with them came a sound of faint knocking, like fingernails against iron. The men fled, never to return, but they carried the story back to the city. By morning, Pittsburgh was alive with whispers. Some said Evangeline was preserved by the hand of God, a martyr for the sins of the barons. Others said it was something darker, that Cornelius and his syndicate had bargained with forces older than industry, older than America itself, binding her in eternal frost as both punishment and warning. The police sealed the estate again, but the legend had already reignited. Students, radicals, priests, and drunks all crept to the edge of the Vandermark grounds, pressing their ears against the earth, listening for the knock. And some swore they heard it. One thing was certain. The ice never melted. Not in summer, not in fire, not in time. Evangeline remained as she was, frozen in defiance, her silent body more powerful than any weapon. She had become the eternal witness, a ghost carved in ice, proof that the empire of fear had failed to erase her. And the city, trembling in both dread and awe, asked the question that has never been answered. Was she still alive beneath that frost? Or was she something worse, something that refused to die? The legend of Evangeline did not stay confined to Pittsburgh's borders. By the 1930s, her name was carried on the lips of striking workers in Chicago, whispered among miners in West Virginia, muttered in the breadlines of New York. She had become more than a ghost. She was a symbol, a frozen saint, a martyr who had uncovered the machinery of lies that ground down ordinary men and women beneath the wheels of industry. Union organizers spoke of her in hushed reverence. They claimed that when they rallied against the mill owners, when they faced down the batons of strikebreakers and the muzzles of rifles, a cold wind sometimes passed through the crowd, bracing them, steadying them. Evangeline walks with us, they said. She is the ice that cannot melt, the silence that cannot be silenced. The barons, of course, despised her name. They called it dangerous superstition, a story invented to stir unrest. But the harder they tried to suppress it, the stronger it grew. Pamphlets were printed with her likeness, her pale face, her emerald gown, her eyes half open as if she were not entirely asleep. Preachers thundered from pulpits, warning that Evangeline was a curse upon the godless, a specter haunting America's progress. Yet in the shadows of factories, in the dark corners of taverns, her legend became a quiet vow. What the powerful bury, the poor will remember. Even the government took notice. In hushed meetings, men in gray suits spoke of the Evangeline problem. They feared she would become a rallying cry for the dispossessed, an icon for revolution. Some even proposed raiding the Vandermark estate once and for all, destroying whatever lay in the icehouse, erasing her from memory. But others hesitated. For if Evangeline had survived the decades untouched, if she truly remained whole in her tomb of frost, then destroying her might unleash something far worse than whispers. And so the Vandermark grounds remained sealed, patrolled, avoided. But no amount of chain or iron could keep Evangeline from spreading. She was no longer just a woman. She was a specter in every strike, every riot, every moment when the poor turned against the rich. Her silence became the roar of the crowd. Her frozen vigil became a promise of reckoning. The legend had crossed from haunting into prophecy. Evangeline was no longer trapped in the ice, she was everywhere. By the 1950s, Evangeline was no longer just folklore. She was an unsolved question, a living riddle that scholars, skeptics, and zealots alike tried to unravel. Universities sent researchers to Pittsburgh under the guise of industrial history projects. Newspapers dispatched journalists eager to write the next great American Gothic exposé. And the public, now armed with cameras, tape recorders, and flashbulbs, demanded proof. The Vandermark estate, rotting, vine-choked, and half-collapsed, became the center of their obsession. Trespassers slipped past guards with notebooks in hand, eager to glimpse the sealed icehouse. A few claimed success. Grainy photographs surfaced in tabloids. A pale face behind frost, the suggestion of a gown trapped in ice. Some dismissed them as hoaxes, others swore they were genuine. But one thing was undeniable. Every man or woman who entered the ice house came out changed. One journalist, Richard Delaney, wrote in the Pittsburgh Gazette of his brief visit. He described the air inside as unnatural, neither warm nor cold, but dead. A vacuum of feeling, as if the very laws of nature had been suspended. He swore he saw her, eyes still open, lips still tinged with frost. But what unsettled him most was not her appearance, it was the sound. A slow, deliberate rhythm echoing through the chamber walls. Knock, pause, knock, pause, as if the ice itself still remembered. Delaney never wrote another article. Months later, he was found drowned in the Monongahela. His lungs filled not with river water, but with something strangely clear and crystalline, like melted ice. Scientists offered their theories. Some suggested a perfect accident of preservation, minerals in the groundwater, a freak balance of temperature and geology. Others whispered darker possibilities that Cornelius Vandermark and his syndicate had experimented with early cryogenics, sacrificing Evangeline in their pursuit of cheating death. But when reporters pressed for evidence, documents seemed to vanish. Records were burned, archives gutted. Someone wanted the truth buried as deep as Evangeline herself. And still the legend spread. Tourists came in droves, peering through the broken gates of the estate, daring one another to knock on the iron door of the ice house. Children dared to whisper her name in the dark. Ministers declared her a demon. Activists painted her face on banners during strikes, their voices echoing the same refrain. The ice never melts. By the close of the decade, Evangeline was no longer a mystery to be solved. She had become a question that could never be answered, a living paradox. And the more the world advanced, the more she lingered, stubborn and silent, waiting for the moment when the frost would crack. By the 1970s, Evangeline was no longer just a ghost story or a laborer's hymn. She had become a cipher for every paranoia of the modern age. Conspiracy theorists tied her to secret government programs, claiming the CIA had studied her as a Cold War weapon, proof that America could hold death at bay. Occultists gathered at the ruined Vandermark estate under the cover of night, convinced she was no martyr but a gatekeeper, her ice a prison meant to contain something far older than the Steel Syndicate's crimes. In the 1980s, as the Cold War reached its fever pitch, rumors surfaced that Soviet agents had tried to infiltrate the estate. Some claimed they even chipped at the ice, trying to extract a fragment of her frost to weaponize. The story goes that they vanished without a trace, leaving only tools frozen solid, as if swallowed by the air itself. The estate was then fenced with razor wire, sealed tighter than ever. But still the legend grew. By the 1990s, Evangeline was an underground obsession. Zines, tapes, and early internet forums buzzed with speculation. Was she a woman, or something reborn through industry sins? Was she preserved by accident, or had Cornelius made a covenant with something that demanded her sacrifice? Photographs circulated, always blurred, always half in shadow off what might have been her face staring out from frost. For some, she was a saint of rebellion. For others, the first proof that humanity had trespassed into forces it could never master. And then silence. At the turn of the millennium, the estate was finally razed. Developers cleared the grounds, promising new condos and office towers. Bulldozers rolled over the mansion's bones, and the ice house was drilled deep, its stone walls shattered. Officially, the workmen reported nothing inside. No body, no frost, no emerald gown. Only a hollow pit where the cold seemed to linger longer than it should. But those who worked the site told another story. They spoke of machinery that froze without cause, of voices whispering beneath the roar of engines, of a pale figure glimpsed between dust and shadow. One man swore he heard its slow, deliberate rhythm, echoing even as the walls crumbled. Knock, pause, knock, pause. The development project collapsed in lawsuits, bankruptcies, and accidents. The ground remains barren to this day, an empty lot in the heart of Pittsburgh, fenced off and avoided. Children still dare each other to approach at night, swearing that if you press your ear to the soil, you will hear her. The ice never melts. The silence never breaks. And somewhere beneath the city, Evangeline waits, neither alive nor dead, preserved in defiance, an eternal witness to the sins of men. The syndicate is gone. Cornelius is dust. The empire has rotted. But she endures. And if you listen closely, you will hear her knocking still. The ice never melts, and neither do the stories we tell here. If this tale left a chill in your bones, step deeper into the shadows with Mesubscribe, and let the next horror find you. You've heard the knocks, you've walked through the frost. Now I want to hear from you. What do you believe happened to Evangeline? Was she a victim, or something far more powerful? Leave your mark in the comments, and let's see which truth rises from the ice. Every week, another secret unearthed. Another forgotten terror dragged back into the light. Subscribe so you don't miss the next name whispered from history's grave. Trust me, you'll want to hear it. Legends like this one never die because we keep them alive. Share this story, keep the whispers moving, and tell me what forgotten terror I should exhume next. Your voice decides which shadow rises next from the archives.